G'day everyone. Welcome to the Outback Packers podcast, the podcast where two mates from all the way across the world have a yarn talking Packers football and the green and gold. I'm Nick Gregory, as always, joined by my co-host Iowa Joe. Once again, welcoming on the illustrious, ever famous, ever brilliant Jacob Westendorf. Jacob, how are you? Good to have you back on.
Sports Illustrated writer Jacob Westendorf.
Well, I don't know about illustrious or anything like that, but I appreciate the intro. This is my third or fourth time on this show. I can't remember the numbers. I don't know. I've had so much fun every time. I can tell you this one we're recording at 10:30 Central Time as opposed to, I remember the first one we did at like 2 a.m.
Yeah.
And I told Joe afterwards, I was like, listen, I had a lot of fun, but I can't do that anymore. Like, unless I just stay up the whole time or something. But otherwise, I think at the time my son was probably only like 3 months old or something like that too. So I guess I wasn't sleeping much anyways. But anyways, it's good to be back. Yes. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. I guess you're the first one to introduce me like that. So that's kind of a cool feeling for me at least. But yeah, it's good to be here, even if it's what do we call it? The boring part of the off season. I don't know. Like, it's July, so there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's still not there.
Well, and I have to say, I was probably one of the first ones that you actually told too, wasn't I? Because you like DM'd me and go, "Hey, I need this graphic, but don't tell anybody."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was because that was like, hey, man, shut your mouth, because I don't want anybody else figuring out about what because it wasn't even done yet. Like, we weren't even 100% sure, but I thought that was funny, and I am not a graphic designer by any stretch of the imagination, so it would have looked ridiculous. But I was like, hey, Joe always said he was looking for different ways to do that. But yeah, that was like I said, it wasn't done yet. It was something that started in late April, and then we got through like the off-season part through camp and everything like that. And I was trying to leave Bill alone because during that time of year they're really busy, even if it feels like they're not. And eventually I was just like, hey, if you still want to do this, I still would like to do it. And now it's working, and my first story will publish sometime soon. I don't have an exact date yet for anything like that, but I have written some stuff. It's in the can. It's just a matter of when does it go up. But it's a cool feeling. I like to write. I like doing Packer stuff, so this just gives me another chance to do it. So it's not work if you enjoy it, and I very much do.
Love to hear it. That's great. Yeah, that's awesome. So as you mentioned, Jacob, we're in the midst of dry July. So this is kind of the period of the off season where we're just like, nothing's really happening. It's kind of like full speculation mode even before training camp. I just want to kind of take a step back from all the football activity and kind of just get an idea of like what you're doing in your life in general. Are you working on any projects, or just having fun? Like, what's going on in the life of Jacob?
Well, I remember there was an R2C2 podcast I listened to, which for those who don't, it's called Ryan Rucco and CC Sabathia. And they had Austin Romine on an episode once, and Rucco asks Austin Romine, what are you doing with your life? And CC starts laughing and says, he's got 3 kids. He's watching effing Baby Shark. And I do a lot of that. I got a 3-year-old, and she's turning 15 by the end of September, it feels like. And then my son is 9 months old, and he can crawl and damn near walk now. So I'm chasing him around, it feels like, a vast majority of the time. So the dead period, if you will, for me just kind of ends up getting eaten up by them. But that's a lot of fun. I enjoy doing that. When I'm not doing that, baseball season around here is busy for me. My side hustle, I umpire baseball games. So I've done between Father's Day weekend and the following weekend, I think I umpired 32 games.
Wow.
Between those. Yeah, it was a lot. And my body at the end of it was like, I can't do that anymore. But it was a lot of fun. I enjoy it for the most part. The way I describe that job is I enjoy it 90% of the time. The problem is the 10% of the time that I hate the job, I never want to do it again. So it's, those days are tough and rough, but yeah, that's really it. My kids and just trying to stack some money away. And because football season gets pretty expensive for me, traveling to Green Bay and buying merchandise and hopefully getting ready for buying Super Bowl champions gear and stuff. I don't know how much money you guys spent when the Packers won the Super Bowl in 2010, but I guarantee you mine is over $1,000. Like,
mine's not close to that. I'm very frugal on a lot of the stuff that I get. So I think
good
I got
for
a couple
you,
of
but damn, I was 19 when they won, so I was just like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
Well, to be fair,
James
I
Harden
had
at the
just
strip club, just throwing out money.
well, to be fair, the Sunday that they won, the following week, I had just kind of it was kind of a weird thing where we mutually agreed to separate from work. So I had just kind of technically lost my job. So I wasn't going to be spending a ton of money at that point.
Fair. Well, yeah, I was at the ripe age of 10 when they won. Actually, no, 9. I was 9 years old when they won.
Thank you.
But I will say, when I in 2021, that the injury bug season, I was convinced they were going to the Super Bowl, especially once it was like Merciless came back in the playoffs, and it was so promising, and I was ready to, because I had just started a new job chefing in the south side of Melbourne, and yeah, I told my boss, I'm like, I know I just started, but if the Packers go to the Super Bowl, I'm just going to blow my life savings on tickets and live it up for like the weekend. But it didn't happen, so I still got money, luckily.
I'm happy for you, but yeah, I would have preferred. I remember so when they won in Dallas, they were offering Jerry was offering for $200 you could sit outside and watch the game on a TV or something like that. And at the time, I still am emotionally invested in all that good stuff, but I was very emotionally invested as a 19-year-old. I had never seen any of my favorite sports teams to really know and appreciate. I had never seen any of not the Packers, at least. I guess the Yankees had won a series the prior year, but not the Packers are my number one and always have been and always will be. I had never seen them win a championship. I don't know if it's still on the internet, but there used to be a video on the internet of me sobbing, crying when they won that Super Bowl. Cause that's how emotionally invested I was in that game. And I'm like, I can't picture being okay being in public watching this game happen. Now, if they went back, and it was not a ridiculous place to go or like Arizona or somewhere like that, that would be fun. Anyway, or if, this year, if they were to make a miracle run and go to Vegas, that would be kind of cool. But, I don't know. I wouldn't mind trying to at least be in the area. Cause even having been in Minnesota when the Eagles won the Super Bowl in 2017, whenever that was, there's a lot of cool stuff to do, without going to the game, the Super Bowl experience and all that stuff is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I would like to go and experience that if and when my favorite team gets back there. Cause I was there working that particular year and I have an emotional investment with the Eagles, but that's not my favorite team. And I do not like the New England Patriots. So that just was what it was, but it was fun. I would like to do something like that. Yeah. And I think that's worth the spend. You know what I mean? Even if you don't end up at the game.
Yeah. I mean, I think the same thing. Vegas would probably be a little bit easier for me because I think I got some relatives out there that would be like, all right, I just go stay with them. And,
yep, same.
But like I said, I'm frugal. I don't like to spend tons of money. Trust me, I was having a fit spending all the money I did when I was up in Green Bay a few weeks ago.
So, Joe, how about you? What are you doing non-football?
Am I technically not doing anything football? Because I mean, we still continue to do this on a weekly basis, so we're still in football.
Do you just not exist outside of the podcast? Is it just an isolation chamber, just waiting for the podcast?
I just wait. No, I mean, really, to give a little bit of a behind the scenes thing. I always tell most of our guests before they come on, I let Nick run everything. Nick decides the topics. Nick leads the show. Nick does all this stuff. But usually I'm the one that has to schedule any kind of guests that we have on. So most of the time that I have free, I'm sending out DMs. Hey, when's your schedule open? Hey, would you like to come on? Hey, I know Jacob had it a little rough because I had 24 hours before we started recording. I DM'd him and said, "Hey, you're coming on,"
which is fine. And having known both of you for as long as I have now, letting Nick be the brains behind the operation, that's probably the smart way to go. So
hey, I'm all there. Why do you think I let it happen?
Joe, I'm not taking my shirt off. All right, seriously.
That's all right. Hey, but here's something to chew on. If you want to go by the listener counts on our episodes, Nick had one where he was by himself, and I had one where I was technically soloing. Mine has more listens, so suck it, Jacob.
I mean, Skip Bayless is really popular too, but that doesn't mean.
Now that's cold.
I
am nowhere near
like
Skip Bayless.
No, and if you were, I could promise you, Skip Bayless could offer me to be on his show tomorrow, and I wouldn't do it. So
I would do one episode.
And get booted because I'd give him the finger.
I was just gonna say we would come down to it. The lights would go on. They'd say action. Cameras are rolling. I'd get up, throw everything on the ground, and walk out.
Yeah, just to give him here's what every single person that's sensible thinks about you. Granted, I haven't watched a program with him on it in probably well over a decade.
It's the same.
It was much smarter for me. I remember I used to have a rule. Zach Cruz and I put this rule together, and it was if you retweeted something of Skip Bayless, it was an automatic unfollow. Like I unfollowed you out of principle. And this was 2011, 2012. So if you think about it at that time, it's after the Packers had won the Super Bowl, but when he kind of started in on some of his Rodgers stuff. And that's when LeBron went to Miami, and they lost obviously to Dallas that year. So he had a heyday with LeBron losing in the finals, LeBron getting to the finals, LeBron losing to Boston and being down, and just all kinds of different. I feel like, and this is somebody who I like LeBron James. I feel like all of the dumb stuff that gets said about LeBron is his fault, so I blame him for that too. But that's beside the point. Anyways, I think that's a good rule to follow. Is I just block all that stuff. I haven't seen anything from. And I'm an equal opportunist when it comes to that. I think Bayless is the head of that dragon, but Stephen A. Smith, Colin Cowherd, Nick Wright, which is unfortunate because I actually liked him on the radio, but now that he's on TV, that Emmanuel Acho, all these people that
unbearable.
All these people were and it's unfortunate. Right. It's unfortunate too because one of my favorite radio hosts is Chris Russo, and they've brought him into First Take now, and it's dude, I listen to you every day and you're so much better there than you are on TV. But apparently, TV it's an entertainment business. That's the hard part. And unfortunately, I think the casual person would rather, us sitting here, we'd rather listen to why something happened. Instead, they want to talk about Aaron Rodgers' legacy for the 10 millionth time after the Packers losing a playoff game or something like that. I just I don't find much value in conversations like that. My thing is always I want to learn why something happened. It's not as simple as I think there was one of the couple just interceptions and stuff Rodgers threw. You could figure out, well, it wasn't actually his fault. This is what happened, or this was his fault. The receiver didn't run the wrong route. Nothing, or sometimes it's just the guy made a great play. This isn't the Jair Alexander sack against Minnesota, the rookie or his first year of the COVID season, first game of the COVID season. When everyone was no, that wasn't a corner blitz. Jair just kind of made a mistake and went for it, and it worked. You know what I mean? Those are the kinds of things I like to hear. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, that's not what seems to be what television producers think people want to see and hear.
Mm-hmm. It all goes back to the reality stuff, the reality shows. It's the drama. People want to watch the drama and the constant bickering and the fighting. But to be honest, I probably wouldn't know who Skip Bayless was if it wasn't for the fact that I would see him pop up on Twitter all the time from somebody retweeting or stuff like that. Because I don't pay attention to a lot of that stuff. I'll flip on NFL Network once in a while, or back in the day it was ESPN once in a while, but that was just mainly to catch up on highlights and any kind of news or whatever. But I don't tend to tune into a lot of those types of shows. I mean, I did like watching Pardon the Interruption and Around the Horn for a little bit, but then even those kind of got out there. But I don't follow a lot of that stuff. I would rather listen to, the Game On stuff. I love that, the the smaller people that, the smaller groups that are giving me the same stuff, but I don't have to deal with all the outside stuff to it. And
it's impossible. I think one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have is like, it's impossible, I think, for a national analyst to have intimate knowledge of all 32 teams.
Right.
Like, it's impossible to have that and contextualize it and everything like that. That's why when I see who the Packers, like they play the Bears the first week of the season, I got a pretty decent knowledge of Chicago just living where I live, and it's the Packers' main rival. But I always kind of talk to some of my friends that are fans and just be like, hey, what's the scoop? What's the skinny? Instead of the usual, basic talking points, just why is this happening the way it's happening? How's Chase Claypool doing? Or, just things like that. It's really hard for national analysts to have that knowledge like that, which is where your beat writers and your local guys and stuff like that have a lot of value, in my opinion. The lines are definitely more blurred than they ever have been in terms of fans as analysts. And I think people really like listening to fans. And I think more and more, and I kind of understand it too, because ultimately I don't think anybody ever wanted to become a sports writer that wasn't a sports fan. Like, I don't think that just happened. You know what I mean? And if you're a sports fan, chances are you had a favorite team. Chances are you had a favorite player. And the people now who say like they're not invested in the team, that's fine. I still maintain that everybody has a bias in some way because you're a human. One of my things that I heard a beat writer say was, "Well, I cheer for the story." It's like, okay, so you still have a bias because you're rooting for the drama or, whatever to happen. Like, you're still rooting for something to happen. You don't have just a completely black or, just a non-view of something. You have something that you want to happen. Plus, I don't think it's that hard to figure out who was on Aaron Rodgers' side and who wasn't during the summer of discontent in 2020 or 2021, I guess is when that technically started.
When
I don't think that was hard to figure out. So, and it makes sense. Like, if Rodgers was good to those people, then it makes sense. If he wasn't, then it's kind of hard to see his side of the story. Like, we're human. That's how it works. This is a human game. It's run and talked about. It's played by humans and it's talked about by humans. So there is no such thing. And that's one of my favorite things when somebody says like, hey, you can't be biased if you're commentating a game. Well, I'm sorry, guys. Troy Aikman played for the Dallas Cowboys for 15 years. He's biased towards the Dallas Cowboys. It's natural. Like, I don't think he's not actively up there waving blue and silver pom-poms during the course of the game.
Well, we don't know because we don't get inside the booth too often.
Thankfully. But, yes, when they play the Giants and it's Cowboys-Giants, there's probably still a little bit of that Dallas Cowboy in him. And it's no different. James Jones goes on NFL Network all the time, or maybe not as much anymore, but you say all the time, oh, the Packers 13-3. Like, he predicted Aaron Rodgers winning the MVP in 2020, and all of us were kind of like, really? Like, he didn't have that good of a year last year, but okay. But he did it because he's James Jones. He's boys with Aaron Rodgers, and he was a Packer. Of course he did. Adam Rank, Bear fan, does Bear fan crap. I don't know how he thinks they're winning 12 games, but God bless him. He put it out there.
Well, how about Paul Allen, for God's sake? If he's not completely biased for,
And they should be. Wayne Larrivee is biased towards the Packers. Like, those guys, I don't know. I guess I don't know this 100%, but some of those guys are paid by the team to do stuff. Like, not only that, when I'm listening, if I'm a Packer fan and I'm listening to Wayne Larrivee, I want him to be excited that my favorite team is doing well because this is the Packers radio network. I didn't tune in to Wayne Larrivee to hear measured analysis. I tuned in to hear Larry McCarron yelling yes when they score. Now, do I think Paul Allen is a little ridiculous with him freaking out about Jair Alexander doing the gritty or screaming and shouting at the field and just being upset at other teams being happy that they won or something like that? Sure. Do Vikings fans love it? They probably do. I'm not friends with too many Viking fans. I have better choices in my life that I've made, but I imagine they really like Paul Allen.
Or his epic meltdown with the Favre interception. And
one of my favorite things ever. One of my favorite things ever.
But yeah, there's always going to be some kind of bias there. Now, isn't there isn't Matt Schneidman? He's not a professed Packer fan, is he?
No, and he's not from around. Like he's
right.
Like for example, Demovsky is not from Green Bay, but he's lived there for a very long time. I think Wilde is from the area.
Yeah.
I know Wes, for example, is from the area.
Yeah.
But yeah, I believe Matt's from New York because I know he's a big Yankee fan.
Yeah.
And he went to Syracuse, obviously, so you got that too. But yeah, and I don't mind that. I kind of like the perspective that Matt provides as somebody who isn't from around here and isn't indoctrinated into the Packer way, if you will. So he kind of, thinks that maybe they should do some things differently. And I certainly think that sometimes too. So I appreciate his perspective. Overall, I have my quibbles with one here or there. No, you're not going to get me to name names, but I think we're in relatively good hands with the Packers beat.
Yeah. Oh, I have no issues with them. I mean, there's one that I've kind of not had good things to say about, but I won't name names either just because of stuff. But
yeah. No, totally.
But I just sometimes it surprises me when people who write for teams aren't fans of those teams, because I always grew up with the perception that if the only way that you could get in with the team is if you had a connection, if you were a fan or you had some kind of, so, when you start learning, oh, well, this guy didn't, he didn't even grow up in the community, he knows, but he's writing for the team. So it's interesting perspectives, but yeah, just to go back to your point, there's bias everywhere and there's no way you're going to get out of it. I don't care what they say.
We got a topic we had to go through tonight. So, Nick, do you want to go?
Absolutely. Yeah, talk Nick.
So, now we're all caught up and warmed up. So today, I just want to kind of go through a bit of a fun thought experiment exercise. I really enjoy doing these like what ifs. We're going to go through a few scenarios of what if history was a little bit different? What would we do? What would we have done in retrospect, or what would we have done at the time? And how are those changing variables going to affect what would have happened after that? The kind of ripple, the butterfly effect after these events. I just find this to be such an interesting thought process because, even like one draft pick being swapped places, small things like that, or one free agent signing could really mean like a colossal difference in the whole direction of a franchise. So the one I want to start with is the one I thought was the most obvious, which is, what if Jordan Love was never drafted in 2020? What if they trade up for a receiver? What if they don't trade up at all for Jordan Love and just hang around and whoever comes to them, like maybe like a Pittman or a T. Higgins, or, there's so many different possibilities. But I mean, I'll let you guys kind of start. What do you think is the overwhelming effect of this not happening?
Well, gosh, it's crazy because it feels like it wasn't that long ago, but it also feels like it was an eternity ago when the Packers drafted Jordan Love. And I remember sitting there in stunned silence when they picked him. I knew Gutekunst had said like they would never pass on an opportunity to draft a franchise quarterback, even in the first round. But I just, like, they were just in the NFC title. All the talking points that have been exhausted over and over again. I really thought they would try and find somebody that was going to help them win, right then and there. You mentioned T. Higgins. That was somebody who didn't meet the athletic thresholds the Packers have typically coveted at the receiver position. So I never really thought he was a guy they were going to take. I know that's a popular name tossed out there, and I think him and Devontae would have made a great 1-2 punch. Maybe not necessarily right away that year like people think, but, I don't know. As far as what the overall take on that is, Aaron Rodgers said it in his appearance with Pat McAfee where he said he wanted to go play for the Jets. That kind of set everything in motion. I do think the Packers thought there was a world last year where Jordan Love never became the preferred starter in Green Bay. I do think that they thought that. And they gave him Gutekunst has even said when they gave him that contract, they had multiple years in mind. But it didn't work out that way for a bunch of different reasons. Then the question is, the Packers draft Jordan Love. Once the dust settles, if you're talking yourself into the pick, you got to be like, I can understand why they took a quarterback. Rodgers didn't look that great at the end of 2019. They got bombed in the playoffs again. We all kind of thought that 13-3 finish was a bit of fool's gold. I mean, hell, guys, I think I picked the Packers to finish 10-6 in 2020, maybe 9-7. I don't remember the exacts, but that's not 13-3, and they were the best team in the NFL that year. Like they were, and that's the part that kind of stings the most about the whole thing. But how does that all shake out? I know. This has been reported by Rappaport and Breer and a bunch of other stuff. They tried to trade up for Justin Jefferson, just didn't work. Getting up from 30 to 21, which is where they would have had to get maybe even 20 or 19 because of the way that particular board shook out. They tried to do that. They were moving up for Brandon Ayuk. They were making calls to move up for Brandon Ayuk. And then the 49ers moved up and grabbed him. And then the Packers kind of pivoted to Jordan Love from there. I think it was kind of we'll take him if he's, if these scenarios hit. The reporting has been they were moving up for either a receiver or an offensive tackle. Neither one of those were available. You could argue they should have just stayed at 30 and taken Higgins or Michael Pittman if you really liked him, which I did. Antoine Winfield was another guy. I mean, granted, I'm not trying to justify the pick because the reality of the situation is at the time I did not approve of the pick. And even as we sit here 3 years later, I still don't. Just because I was not high on Jordan Love, the prospect. In my opinion, this was not Aaron Rodgers, who was supposed to be the number one overall pick, falling into your lap with Favre hem-hawing about retirement, which Rodgers only really started doing after they picked Jordan Love, and he really only started being really weird after they picked Jordan Love. This was apparently a very life-changing thing for Aaron Rodgers as well, which I understand. I am certainly not a Rodgers apologist, but that being said, I don't think that this was the correct decision at the time. Now, Jordan Love can make it the correct decision. There's only one way to do that, and he's got to be really good. And if he's not, then, we're talking about there is a non-zero, I'm not saying this is a great chance, there is a non-zero chance that we are doing this podcast this time next year talking about how the Packers fired Brian Gutekunst and Matt LaFleur and dumped Jordan Love because he was terrible. The Jets went and played in the conference championship game. Rodgers had a resurgent season. They just lost to Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. Couldn't get over that hump, and Green Bay is picking first. So Green Bay's drafted, I guess if we're doing it at this time, they drafted Caleb Williams with general manager, insert name here, and their new head coach that will be taking the reins. That is a possibility. It's not a likely one, but I do not at all ascribe to this theory that is out there from some Packer fans that this is a free pass type of year.
No,
I don't agree. Bill Huber, my guy, says all the time, it doesn't say division title town in Green Bay, Wisconsin. It says title town. So with that in mind, do they in their heart of hearts think they're competing for a Super Bowl this year? No. But if you're the worst team in the NFL, everything's broken. And not only that, then every single criticism of this Jordan Love selection, because if they're the worst team in the NFL, chances are it's because Jordan Love is really bad. I can't see a scenario where we're like, oh man, Love was awesome. You know what? They scored 35 points a game and the defense just gave up 40. That's just not likely. If a quarterback is passable, a team wins 6 or 7 games. Give or take. I mean, I'm oversimplifying that to some degree, but I don't ascribe to that theory. And that's part of this conversation as well. And it makes the pick. It's a pivot point, very similar to the way that it was when Ted Thompson drafted Aaron Rodgers. And I can promise you this same kind of conversation we would have had in 2008, 2009. Listen, if Favre goes on and wins the Super Bowl for one of these other teams that he plays for, and Rodgers is terrible and the Packers are bad, Ted and Mike and all these guys unceremoniously jettisoned out of town, and we blame them for ruining the greatest thing that had ever happened to the Packers to date, which was Brett Favre. And that's certainly something that can happen here. So it's a lot of things that could happen now. if it never happened, then obviously those things never happen. I think one of the questions, and Nick and Joe, I'm curious on your thought on this. One of the things is, what position are they in now? I don't know. If they didn't draft Jordan Love, then I'm thinking they wouldn't have. If everything else stayed the same, I don't think they would have drafted a quarterback when they did. Or if they hadn't drafted Love, maybe they draft Jalen Hurts in the second round, and he's the backup now, turning into the starter as they move on from Aaron Rodgers. Maybe they haven't moved on from Rodgers at all. But one of the popular theories is Jordan Love's selection lit a fire under Aaron Rodgers, and he won those back-to-back league MVPs because of that. I'm curious. I don't think it's zero. Aaron Rodgers scorned as one of the greatest players in the history of the NFL. But I also think that's not giving enough credit to the fact that he's also, on his own, one of the greatest players we've ever seen. But I'm curious what you guys think as far as, did that reinvigorate him, and maybe that's something that will follow him to New York now, as there's a new slight, if you will, towards the Packers. Think he's done, or they don't want him around anymore. So he could certainly use that as motivation. Just what do you guys think on that?
Well, I know what Nick's answer is going to be, because Nick has been riding the Love train forever. So I'm pretty certain I know what Nick's answer is going to be on that. Mine is, I think it did a little bit. I'm not going to say it was a 100%, they drafted Jordan Love and Rodgers, was pissed off and went on to back-to-back MVPs and whatever. But I think it helped. I think there was a ton of motivation there for him anyway. 2019, yeah, whatever, but he still didn't look great, like you said. And you've got the media saying, well, is he washed? Is he washed? Is he washed? And then add on top of that the Packers drafting Love, and then add on top of that everything else that went on. I think it was just a combination of it, and the Jordan Love pick was just the icing on the cake, or the cherry on the sundae, or whatever analogy you want to use for it. But that's my opinion of it. I was never really happy with the Love pick, and it wasn't because I knew they were going to do it eventually. They always have this history. The recent history that we have is, when your quarterback starts aging, we're going to draft somebody. If we keep him, we keep him. If we don't, we'll get whatever we can out of him. But, we saw it with Favre or Rodgers getting drafted. It just, that seemed to be the way they were leaning. I wasn't too happy with the Love pick because, like you said, Jacob, I wasn't the highest on him as a prospect. There was just too much guesswork with him. I know there was stuff saying that he could be a potential number one overall pick, but I also saw a lot of stuff that said he could fall to the third or fourth round. There was just too much guesswork with him to know what he was actually going to be. But just to answer your question, I would say that no, it wasn't the purely sole reason for Rodgers' resurgence, but I do think it was like the topper, the final straw or whatever. I mean, I can come up with more of these if you really want.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Less analogies from you, less words from you in general. Less thinking in general, probably a good thing. Nick, please add some brains to this operation, please.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, like, in my opinion, I think that those MVPs are more of an indication of LaFleur than they are of Rodgers necessarily. Not to take away from the fact that Rodgers is obviously, like you said, Jacob, amazing talent, an all-timer. I just think that's more about kind of what he did to implement his offense and kind of everyone getting comfortable as a whole. And yeah, I think it's like it would be disingenuous to say that like Love was the only reason why he got those MVPs, but I think we've kind of seen at this point that it obviously did affect him like a lot mentally, and it did light a fire under his ass to kind of like assert himself. Yeah, like I don't think anyone, if they were being honest, really believed that Love had ever had a chance of like unseating him or really threatening his job. So I'm not gonna. I would never use that as like a talking point. But just the idea that the organization didn't believe in him anymore definitely, obviously hurt his feelings, and that's totally fair. And yeah, I think I would have a tough time. Like, no matter what Rodgers says, I would have a tough time believing that didn't make a really big impact in the way that he played and approached the offseason that year.
Well, he's talked about it. I mean, his first line or one of his first lines to McAfee and everything he's always said about Jordan Love, like he refers to him as my replacement. They drafted my replacement. That is what and I think he's done well with Jordan Love. Jordan has talked about glowingly about his time with Rodgers, which vastly different than what we got from stories with Rodgers and Favre, right? Like Favre had some vitriol towards Rodgers, and he and Rodgers didn't hit it off right off the bat or anything like that. So I don't think Rodgers went out of his way to sabotage Love or anything like that. That being said, I think I understand in my own job if they hire somebody that theoretically threatens my standing or anything like that. If you will, maybe it doesn't hurt my feelings to the way that it has with Rodgers, because clearly it did. Like I am of the belief 100% too that his fractured relationship with Brian Gutekunst is 100% related to that. And we even heard with the way he talked to McAfee when he said he was leaving with Matt LaFleur too. Like him and LaFleur have a good relationship, but it's kind of like the Mike McCarthy thing with him taking Alex Smith instead of Rodgers. He still held that grudge over him for taking Smith instead of him. He still held that grudge with Matt LaFleur of basically saying like, the coach kind of being like, well, he's with you or whatever. It's like he wanted him too. They're not signing off on that pick if the coach says, no, I think he sucks. I mean, maybe they do, but Rodgers certainly wouldn't think that way. Like, I understand it. I just think that at some point, I don't know. I don't think there's anything the Packers could have done to fully repair that relationship with him since they drafted him, because they begged him to come back. They gave him Randall Cobb like he wanted after that first year, right? And then they spent all that time. They've pushed a boatload of salary cap money into the future. They've kept a team together. They kept all of his guys together. And then, last year he didn't have the greatest year. Devontae didn't want to come back, and he, whatever, that might be a whole separate talking point. But they bring all those guys back, and then they don't have the season they want. And the only path forward, one of the other problems with the Packers, and Rodgers can say all he wants about him caring about the way they treat veterans out the door or whatever. This really it's mostly to do with him, and the small part that isn't has to do with his friends, Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb, down the line. And I get it. It's a cold business. That's just kind of the way that it works. But the only way for this Packers team to get better after 2022 was, hey, Alan Lazard's not coming back. Randall Cobb's not coming back. Bob Tunyon, maybe Mercedes Lewis. Like if they kept Rodgers, they probably would have kept some of those guys. But the only path forward I saw for this team, if Rodgers was going to be back, was the only way for them to get better was for his buddies to not be around anymore. And he said, again, in another interview that he wants those guys in his locker room and on his team and all that stuff. And the Jets have basically done all of that for him. And we'll see if it works. But ultimately, like I said, I think they drafted my replacement is where this whole thing stopped. And at some point, the Packers did, in my opinion, everything they could to try and repair that with him. They gave him a record-setting contract extension last year with, if the Packers finish 11-6 and lose in the playoffs last year, Rodgers is back. I am pretty convinced of that. And Jordan Love never becomes the team's starting quarterback. Like the Packers were willing to do that. Rodgers apparently never felt secure enough to do that, which is odd to me. But, as Mark Murphy once quoted the late Ted Thompson, he's a complicated fella. So it's I will say this. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I loved Aaron Rodgers. He was awesome. One of my favorite players that I've ever seen. He's the best Packer I have ever seen play. That being said, it is a little bit of just like a weight lifted off the shoulders kind of thing to not have to wait on what stupid thing is he going to say today, or what passive aggressive comment is he going to make to the media today? Just whatever when it comes to stuff. And granted, I promise you, if Jordan Love sucks, I will be longing for those things. Because trust me, I can deal with Rodgers lying to the media about being vaccinated and the crap storm that follows that if he's playing at an MVP level. Or I can handle him talking about taking hallucinogens and all that stuff if he's playing like an MVP. As long as he's not doing anything illegal and awful, then I can handle annoying if he's playing like an MVP. If he's playing like last year, then it's not worth it anymore. But yeah, it's a weight lifted off. That's kind of the point I was getting at to ask you guys. It feels like a weight lifted off for me to just be like, okay, maybe Jordan Love will just play and then do his media session, and that'll be it. And then we'll watch the game the next week and see how that goes too.
No, totally. I'd always been a Rodgers fan. I know I don't have receipts on it or anything, but I was one of the few that I knew that was happy when he was drafted. Just because of something that you said earlier, Jacob, that, we were starting to get the Favre waffling back and forth, Oh, well, I want to play. Well, maybe not. I think I might retire. Oh, I want to play. That was starting to get old, and it was nice to have them have a backup plan in case that he would, just say, all right, well, I'm done. And, he was there for the longest time, was slated to be the number one overall pick that year.
Mm-hmm.
And to get him at pick, 24, when he was supposed to be the number one overall, that's nuts. So I was really happy with it. But like you just said, I got tired of it. I don't know how many times on this podcast I've said, I just want the drama to be done. Love the guy, but let's stop the drama. Cut the drama. Let's end this drama. And I'm happy he's gone. Well, I'm happy it's over. I don't know if I can say I'm happy he's gone. I just can say that I'm happy it's over.
Yep.
Like I always been saying for a while, I'm excited for this coming season just because this is the first time in a long time we don't know what's going to happen. With Rodgers, we were pretty sure we were going to make the playoffs every year. With Rodgers, we knew he was going to throw more touchdowns than interceptions. With Rodgers, we knew this was going to happen. We don't have that this year. We have no clue.
With Rodgers, if he's healthy, like I mentioned earlier, that icky scenario where the worst team in the NFL, there was no scenario where 3-14, 3-13, whatever, was on the table. There was no scenario with a healthy Aaron Rodgers that think about it. Rodgers was healthy all of last year. They weren't very good, and they still won 8 games.
Yeah.
And that's not all a credit to him, but quarterback wins isn't a stat, but if your quarterback is healthy and good, this is kind of why I'm still skeptical about Justin Fields. Cause if he's this alleged transcendent talent, how did they finish 3-14? But that's a separate topic for a different day. If your quarterback's really good and healthy, or at least good and healthy for a majority of the year, Kirk Cousins rolls out of bed. They're 8-8. Some variance one way or the other. They end up 6-10, but a team quarterbacked by Kirk Cousins for 16 games, 17 games now, isn't drafting in the top 5. Most likely. Yeah. I say that now, and the Vikings will be one of the worst teams in football, but
fingers crossed.
Yeah. That's one of those things with Rodgers that we had as a luxury for so long is I remember when Favre and that team went 4-12, and that's the worst season I've ever experienced in my lifetime as a Packers fan from a record standpoint. And it was painful. They were hard to watch on a week-to-week basis. And granted, I was 14 at the time, so blissfully ignorant to all the other stupidity that comes with everything else. But that team was terrible, but it took a lot for that team to get there. And Favre was awful at that stage of his career.
That was one of the broken thumb years, wasn't it?
Maybe. I don't remember. Jordan Love could be I don't think he's that bad. I don't. Even as somebody who's not as big of a fan of his as maybe some others, I don't think he's that bad, but he could be. Like, what if he is? Because if he's that bad quarterback, young offense, I mean, there's a scenario, again, maybe not the most likely one, but there's a scenario where they're the worst team in the NFL. Those are scenarios that did not exist when Rodgers was the quarterback. Or insert Hall of Famer. Kansas City will not be one of the worst teams in the NFL ever as long as Patrick Mahomes is healthy. Because that's what those guys do to those teams.
Totally. Yeah. I think the last thing I want to say before we go to the next what if is that if Jordan Love doesn't get drafted in 2020, I strongly believe that Will Levis is a Packer right now.
Oh, God in heaven.
Guarantee.
Probably.
Almost.
If everything plays out the same, gosh. Because Green Bay they would have picked 13th if they still trade Rodgers to the Jets and everything like that. I wonder if they would have picked him at 13. He ended up going, 35th or whatever to Tennessee?
Yeah. I honestly, and kind of knowing what we know about Goot now, if I had 2 picks in the first round especially, I think he goes in 13.
Yeah.
If I had 1 pick, he might trade down maybe, or even just if it was later on. But if it's if he has 2 picks, I think he just goes for it. He did it with the inside linebacker last year. You know what I mean?
The other part of me wonders, too, though, is they don't pick Love. Say Rodgers still asks to be traded. Do they trade him that draft night and draft Justin Fields, Trey Lance? Who else was in that quarterback? Well, they weren't getting Trevor Lawrence, but
not. Yeah, I mean, they wouldn't have gotten. I mean, Zach Wilson, right? But I mean, hopefully not.
Zach Wilson, yeah. I mean, the Jets probably wouldn't have. Who he would have gotten traded to. This is a complete hypothetical, but say it was the Jets, then they would have had the 2nd overall pick. Chances are it would have been Denver, who was 9th, which they theoretically could have drafted Justin Fields or Mac Jones in one of those spots to do that. So I don't think they would have done that. I still think they would have groveled and tried to get him back, but maybe after the San Francisco playoff loss, they would have been more willing to deal him. And then hey, we got a bunch of ammo to stink this year, go with a bridge quarterback, whatever. And then next year, trade up and grab whoever the next guy is for the quarterback class. Because this year
probably would have ended up with Tannehill.
Or something to that effect,
yeah.
Right? I don't know what it's a lot of different things.
Well, the only reason I think that is because I think, LaFleur was down there Tannehill's first year in Tennessee.
Yeah, they benched Mariota for Tannehill by the middle part of that year.
So I have a feeling the Packers somehow would have ended up with Tannehill had they not drafted Love and Rodgers still wanted out.
Yeah, maybe for a year.
But I could see Nick's point, because if you go through the athletic, if you want to go RAS score or whatever, but if you go through all that stuff, Will Levis and Jordan Love are side by side.
High upside, big arm.
Yeah, Levis is the Packers type. He absolutely is.
Yeah, that's why if we had done this trade for that quarterback class I was talking about, I would bet you T-Law would have been 1, but I would bet you Green Bay liked Trey Lance in that class.
For sure, yeah.
Oh, definitely. Just with all the rumors that, they were wanting to have him thrown in if the Packers traded Rodgers to San Francisco, that tells me that they were high on him too.
All right, awesome.
All right, what's your next one, Nick?
Ready to go to the next one, which is kind of in a similar vein. This is Jacob's question. What if Love was still drafted, but the Packers win it all in 2020?
Yeah, I've said this for a while, that I think had Rodgers won a Super Bowl, whether it was 2020, 2021, 2022, he'd been done. I think that would have been his final thing. He would have, because that would have been his quote-unquote fairy tale, right off in the sunset. And I think had they won it, he would have said, he would have given them the middle finger and said, fuck you guys, see what happens, and he would have rode off into the sunset.
And the optics would have been cool. That would have been the way. I say this all the time. There's a reason the John Elway is as special as it is, and it's because it just doesn't happen. And you look at, in our lifetime, that you could think of. How many great players have played their entire career? Like even Peyton Manning had a storybook ending by winning the Super Bowl, but it wasn't with the Colts. It was different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, how many players played their entire career as a face of the franchise type player with one team? You know,
Anymore, not many.
there aren't many. I mean, Dirk Nowitzki, Kobe Bryant tried to find his way off the Lakers like 4 different times, but it never worked. So he was with one team the whole time. John Elway is the one in the NFL that comes to mind. He wins 2 Super Bowls and then he goes home. You know, I wonder if Rodgers would have done that, or do the Packers try and say, hey, we've got something real special here with Rodgers and LaFleur, and they try and keep that whole thing together, and Rodgers says, hey, I'll stay, and we could try and keep making runs at this, but this kid's got to go. And would they have acquiesced to something like that? Because it's like, well, I mean, you just won the MVP and the Super Bowl. Like, what can we even argue about at this point? That's the whole point of this whole operation, is to win championships. So they would have possibly done that. I do tend to side with Joe's thought, though, that I remember after the Bucks championship game, and when he said like my future's uncertain and all, we didn't realize everything else that was going on behind the scenes and everything, but I thought he was retiring, or at least that it was going to be a very serious consideration that he could retire. And then I thought that even more after they lost to San Francisco. And last year, after his last press conference, I definitely thought that it was a possibility that he would retire. But that didn't happen, obviously. But I do think if they win a championship, it's a much stronger consideration than what it would have been. But if he stays and plays after they win a championship, I think they have to choose one of Rodgers or Love right then and there, instead of kind of doing what they've done the last couple of years, where they've tried to keep the present and the future at the forefront and have Love in the background here doing his thing. I think Rodgers would have said, and maybe Gutekunst gets more bold and is just like, hey, you know, I picked this guy and we think he can play, so let's get a ransom for you, and we have this really good roster. I can't imagine that, because I've said about 1,000 times that everybody can say like, oh, they should have traded Rodgers after they lost San Francisco. And I've said that before. But easy for idiot like me who sits here and his job isn't on the line to be the first person to ever trade the reigning league MVP. Well, people definitely aren't trading the reigning league MVP that just won a Super Bowl. Like New England, Tom Brady, they didn't trade him, but they basically kind of let Tom Brady go to Tampa Bay. Do you think that would have happened if they had won a Super Bowl the previous season instead of losing a first-round playoff game to the Tennessee Titans? Probably not, right? So if they win in 2020, I definitely think they choose between Rodgers and Love right there, and I think they choose Rodgers, and he may still be the quarterback now. He may not be, and we might be going through the Los Angeles Rams type, Tampa Bay Bucks type rebuild with, you know, the aging quarterback either retiring, or in the Rams case, it's just everybody moving on because they don't have any draft picks or capital to do anything. But it's interesting, and it's a reality I frankly wish that we lived in, because that 2020 team was so good, man.
Yep.
They were so good. I was so like, when they lost the championship games in 16 to Atlanta and 19 to San Francisco, I was sad, but it was just kind of like, well, yeah, we weren't better than them. I'm sorry. You can tell me 1,000 times Green Bay was better than Tampa Bay. And they would have beaten the piss out of that Chiefs team, because Green Bay had their pass rush all together, and Kansas City started 4 guards and a center in that Super Bowl. Like, they just would not have been able to block the Smith brothers and Rashawn and Kenny Clark. That was that 2020 season was Kenny Clark's best season in the last 3 or 4 years. Dean Lowry had a great year that year rushing the passer. Like, it was just everything lined up for them. And they choked. You know, that's one where they didn't choke against San Francisco. They choked against Seattle, different story. They didn't choke against Atlanta. Like, they choked against Tampa Bay. They were the better team. Brady threw 3 picks in the second half. Like, they had every opportunity and should have won. They were the better team. And this is one of those cases too, like 2019, if they beat San Francisco by an act of God, they don't beat Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City 2 weeks later. In 2016, they get railroaded, in my opinion, by the New England Patriots. When they lose to Seattle, I know they had already beaten New England that year, but I just really have a hard time saying they would have beaten New England twice and just counting that as a second Super Bowl. I don't know if they would have won that. I am so confident they would have beaten Kansas City. And in 2021, the following year too, I think like the Packers should have won back-to-back Super Bowls. Because 2021, if they beat San Francisco, that Rams team pisses their pants every time they come to Lambeau Field. And that Bengals offensive line wasn't blocking Zadarius Smith, Preston Smith, Rashawn Gary, Whitney Merciless, all those guys. Are you kidding me? And the Packers had already beaten that Bengals team that year, and they didn't even play that well. So I definitely think they could have won back-to-back titles, but that's not the reality we live in. The question you'd ask was, what if they had won it all that first year? Like I said, I think to wrap it full circle, the choice they made between Love and Rodgers, they choose the other one. They choose Rodgers, and I think they have to do it right there.
Something I think is kind of interesting to go into as well is, what if they win, but Rodgers doesn't retire? I think that Love is traded, basically, because they have to commit to Rodgers then if he wants to stay on. And then does that mean that the relationship is kind of repaired and then Rodgers does kind of eventually get that storybook ending? Or, perhaps they just take a year to retool and kind of, like you said, Jacob, maybe win 2 in a row, or maybe the team just feels so much more homogenous and kind of unified. Because, it is, the relationship between some of these players was a little bit kind of awkward. And I have no doubt that in the locker room, everyone would have had their own little different opinion on what was happening with Rodgers. I think if the team was kind of, like I said, more homogenous, more unified, I think, it's so interesting to think about kind of where they would have been now. Because if Rodgers wanted to keep playing, and he physically can, he would still be starting for them right now. And we'd be looking at, kind of, same as usual, just going into another year hoping for a Super Bowl.
The only thing that I'm going to maybe disagree with is I don't think Rodgers would have said get rid of Love, because the one thing
not as in he would have, but I think the team would have had to if he just won the Super Bowl.
Well, just
he kind of was doing that anyways.
But see, what the thing is I don't think, because Rodgers has always said, and you got to take what he says with a grain of salt, because we know Rodgers likes to bend the truth. He goes the Jedi way from a certain point of view. But he's never blamed Love. He always blamed the front office. So instead of saying, I want Love gone, I think this would have jump-started the Goody's got to go, or Russ Ball's got to go.
He did that offseason, and that's been confirmed by Charles Robinson, Albert Breer, everything like that. Like, one of his conditions, if you will, to come back after they lost that Tampa championship game was, I'll come back if you fire Brian Gutekunst, which I still remember some people saying, well, they should just do that.
Yeah.
No.
But I think this would have really put it out there. I think this would have really made that center.
It might have emboldened Murphy to do it, like actually do it and give it some credence. But like I said, he already asked for that same offseason anyways. He just would have said, okay, fine. I won you a championship. Brian, granted, Murphy's response should be Gutekunst put together the roster, like it's all one, whatever. But I definitely think that, like I said, Rodgers' relationship with Gutekunst was over once they drafted Jordan Love. I think this would have maybe given Murphy 2 more seconds to think about whether or not he was going to fire Gutekunst to acquiesce to Rodgers. But, I think that he doesn't have a problem with Jordan Love per se. He has a problem with the position Jordan Love plays.
Right.
Which that just is what it is as far as that goes. But yeah, there's a long list of what ifs that could happen if this scenario had played out. And again, I wish it had.
Mm-hmm. No, hard to disagree with that. I want to get into Joe's one next. This is what if they had drafted Drew Lock in 2019? In that year, the first year of Matt LaFleur, Drew Lock in probably the second round instead of Elton Jenkins. If let's say they traded up like with like a 5th or 6th rounder just to get up there. Yeah, so no, basically you're swapping out Jenkins for Drew Lock. How do we feel that plays out? Do we feel as though that affects the way that Rodgers plays? Is it basically just the same what happened, but with Jordan Love and he has to get extended a year earlier or whatever. I mean, how do we feel about this?
I know Rodgers has said in the past about himself, taking a quarterback in the first round is a statement. And he's mentioned it about Love. Trading up in the first round for a quarterback is a statement. Now, are we assuming they take him in the first round, or are we assuming they take him in the second round here?
Well, if you go by all the rumors, they were considering to take him in the Savage spot.
Okay. And I had read that they would have done it for the pick that like the reason Denver took him is because they knew Green Bay would have at 45, which is where they took Elton Jenkins. So no Elton. Number one, that makes the offensive line worse. Nothing against Lane Taylor or whatever, but he's just kind of a replacement level guard.
He was pretty solid that season as well.
Yeah, and he's an Jenkins is an upper level Pro Bowl type player, especially at that position now, and I think he's going to have a big year this year. If the Packers only take Locke in the second round, I don't think that changes a whole lot for Rodgers because like they traded for Deshaun Kaiser, for example, and that wasn't a significant trade. It was kind of a garbage in, garbage out kind of trade, but they've traded for quarterbacks. They've added guys. They were allegedly considering Kaiser, which I think that was proven true, that they were considering him at 33 when they took Kevin King ultimately for that team. I don't think it changes a whole lot other than it makes the team worse because Elton Jenkins isn't on it. And we're all sitting here actually talking about how as Green Bay is cycling through Royce Newman and Jake Hansen and Sean Ryan and these guys that would have played guard instead of Elton over the last couple of years, or Green Bay makes a higher investment in the offensive line, in subsequent years for, whether that's 2020 when they ultimately draft Jordan Love, because they would have been looking for something else that year, obviously. Well, maybe not obviously, but in theory, they'd be looking for something different to draft that particular year. But I don't think that changes Rodgers or lights the fire that we're suggesting happened with Jordan Love. I'm happy that didn't happen because I don't think Drew Lock is proven to not be good. I don't know if Jordan Love is or not, but I feel pretty good in saying Drew Lock isn't. So I'm thankful for that. And Elton, I mean, I'm Mr. Offensive Lineman. Other than maybe my guy Owen Reese, but I'm the guy who was saying Green Bay should pick an offensive tackle at 13 if the right one fell there. And of course, everybody had already decided they needed to take Jackson Smith and Jigba there, and they took neither one of those things. So they took Joe's guy. So nonetheless, I'd be upset.
And what college was that again, Jacob?
Some also ran in the Big Ten. I don't know. The Big Ten runner-up in 2021. Which good for them. Anyways, I don't think it does anything for Rodgers, and ultimately all it does is just get him hit more because Elton's not playing left guard. And I mean, if Bakhtiari's injury still happens and all that stuff, remember Elton played left tackle for most of that. Well, not most, but quite a bit of that 2021 season when Bakhtiari was out, and they kind of got lucky with Yosh Nijman being able to do a few things here or there. So, Elton has quietly saved Green Bay a couple different ways. And it's just something I feel like, even as much as Packer fans we talk about, I still feel like we kind of take it for granted how good he was for this team, really since he's been here. But, in 2020, just being like, well, this week you're playing left guard, next week you're playing right tackle, and then we're going to slide you over to left tackle to start that season, and we'll move you all around. He played center in the 2020 season too. Like, that's not an easy thing to do. He's just, guys like him, and to a lesser degree, Zach Tom, are just so incredibly valuable just because of the way that, Elton's an awesome guard. I think post-injury, he can play a passable level at tackle. Zach Tom can play I think he's a good tackle and can play passable at guard and maybe I think he would be a really good center, actually.
Yeah.
Like, those guys are just, Green Bay has done such a good job at finding those guys and not being guys that just get in the way. Don Barclay's job was to just be in the way, for example. But I'm promising you guys, as much as Green Bay has been spoiled at the quarterback position, it's been pretty rare. It has happened a couple times with, Byron Bell and Justin McCray and some of that later Ted Thompson stuff. But it's been pretty rare.
Early on, too, if you remember. Marshall
Alan
Newhouse
Barber.
And
Yeah. I mean, but it's been pretty rare for the most part that the offensive line has been bad. The Packers have usually been pretty solid, and especially under Gutekunst, where, I mean, they've invested in that position. They draft. This is the first year they haven't drafted one. They drafted 3 guys on day 3 each of the last couple of years. I promise you, shouldn't say I promise you, but the Packers are probably going to have 2 first-round picks. I would bet you just about anything. One of them is going to be an offensive tackle. I will bet almost anything on that as we sit here right now. So I keep answering the question and going on tangents off of that. But yeah, I think that Rodgers doesn't play pissed off and he just gets hit more because Elton's not on the team.
Maybe that's the catalyst for them to get Justin Jefferson in 2020. If they end up being
worse,
if they end up being
not being as good,
if they end up being worse, and then they end up drafting a little bit higher, if they get JJ, I mean, it's hypothetical on top of hypothetical, but that would have been kind of a funny twist of history.
I mean, the only reason I thought of this was because you guys kept bringing up the Jordan Love stuff. And it's like, okay, well, I do remember rumors from that year that they were really high on Drew Lock and that there was a possibility that they could have took him in the Darnell Savage spot. And then he just kept falling and he just kept falling and he just kept falling. I guess my hypothetical would have been more what if they would have took him at the Darnell Savage spot? Because we know how the 2019 season really was for Rodgers. So does that, if they took him in the first round at the Darnell Savage spot, does that speed up the chip on his shoulder? Does that speed up the hatred for Gutekunst, or does that push him more to, all right, well, maybe I'm closer to hanging him up?
Yeah, I mean, if they take him in the first round, then I think you're talking, because that year their draft picks were at 12, 30, and then 44, I think is when Jenkins was taken. So they traded up to 21 to get Savage. I know Locke took a pre-draft visit with Green Bay that year. He was one of those top 30 visits or whatever those things are for pre-draft. So I think that if they took Locke in the first round, then yeah, all that stuff from Jordan Love just starts in motion. It's just remove the lines about Jordan Love and just insert Drew Lock's name in there. And then really what it is they draft Rashawn Gary with your scenario. It's Rashawn Gary, then Drew Lock, then they probably still take Elton. In which case, I don't know, man. I'm like one of the last guys hanging onto that lifeboat of Darnell Savage. I think the only bigger fan in the world right now at this point is Mike Kawano. But
yeah,
Savage was awesome in 2020.
There's still that thread.
Right.
Or not many, but about 5 years now.
Cool. Sorry about that, guys. So yeah, Darnell Savage. We're still hanging on to the last thread of Darnell Savage. I'm with you there, Jacob.
I really liked the Darnell Savage pick. I mean, I was really happy. To be fair, I was more happy about the Savage pick than I was the Gary pick. Because not that I didn't think Gary was athletic and all that, but he had like limited production in college, and to take him that high kind of was mind-boggling to me. But
I loved Savage. Like that was one of my I didn't want them to trade up and grab him in the first round, but like they said, I remember Gutekunst said like they knew that they weren't going to get him if they stayed where they were, which was funny because everyone's like, oh, they could have just waited and got him later or something like that. And Brian Gutekunst was basically like, okay, we know that we couldn't have, to which everyone was like, okay, because Milt Hendrickson came over from Baltimore and told them, hey, Baltimore really likes him. So if you want him, you got to take him here. That's always one of my favorite things about the draft is I can flame on him because it's Peter and he's my friend. But Peter Bukowski says when they take Lucas Van Ness, right? And Peter was one of those all in on Jackson Smith-Jigba. Me, I'm smiling ear to ear. I loved Lucas Van Ness when they took him. That was one of my favorite potential picks that they could have made. And he was like, well, they could have. The annoying part is, he said something along the lines of, the annoying part is they could just get the kid from Kansas State or Will McDonald at 42 or wherever their next pick was. And
then
Will McDonald went like 4 picks later. And then
Yeah.
Felix, the FAU from Kansas State went to Kansas City. So, and Nolan Smith went at 31 or whatever that was to the Eagles. Like they just had none of the like if Green Bay hadn't taken Van Ness, the pass rusher class at 42 gets really thin really quick.
And I think that's why they did it.
Well, and it's just Green Bay. Listen, Green Bay's got a philosophy, guys. I wrote a story on Packer Report for it. I'll send you guys the link if you want to tweet it out if you guys want to do that. But Green Bay's got a philosophy. Positional, with the exception maybe of Quay Walker, which I think, like Nick alluded to earlier, they viewed as a luxury pick. But positional value, line of scrimmage, quarterback, cornerback type players in the first round, and they're every day 2 pick they've used for the last 2 or 3 years, I think I did, has been on offensive players. Yep. Last year it was Christian Watson and Sean Ryan on day 2, and they used 2 second-round picks to get Christian Watson. This year is Jaden Reed, Tucker Kraft, and Luke Musgrave. Like, again, this is why embrace debate is ruined television, but like this whole conversation along how Green Bay doesn't take pass catchers in the first round, to which I say BFD, they've still invested in offense, which is like the buzz phrase everyone likes to use now at the end of the season is, I would like Green Bay to pick offense in the first round. Well, then my favorite part was I would say like, okay, well, let's say they have pick 15 at the time. It would have been 15, 42, and 45. What if they take Paris Johnson? I'm just throwing random names out there. I know they weren't available. Paris Johnson at 15, a pass rusher at 42, and then a receiver at 45. Is that investing in offense? And everyone was like, well, no, because this, and this. Like, okay, so just say what you mean. You want the Packers to pick a receiver in the first round, and that's fine if that's what you want them to do. I don't know. Like, the Packers have such a good track record of finding guys later. Pass rushers, especially, are typically found. The best ones are found in the first round. Rashawn Gary is an example of one of those guys. Van Ness, I think, is going to be very, very good for them. This is where fantasy football and hot take culture has rotted the brain of so many people. And granted, are there cases like, we just talked about earlier, would I have taken Brandon Ayuk? Well, that wasn't an option, but like, a receiver in 2020, sure. Otherwise, there aren't too many places where I can, like, none of the receivers that were available would I have taken over Eric Stokes in 2021. 2022, I would have moved up for Chris Olave, but they chose not to do that. And I don't know. I mean, my thought is now, if they're right on Walker and Wyatt and Watson, like Watson's ceiling is higher than Olave's. So
sure.
I don't know. I just think this discussion, like the Packers do things so poorly by not taking that position in the first round. I can't get behind that.
Totally. All right, cool. Do we want to move on to our last what if here before we finish up?
Yeah.
Awesome. So this is the one that I thought would be really interesting is, what if the Packers didn't hire Matt LaFleur and instead hired Brian Flores or Dan Campbell? Josh McDaniels was technically in consideration, but also he pulled out himself, so it wasn't up to the Packers anyway if they did want to pick him, which I really hope they didn't actually seriously consider that. But this changes a few things for the team, right? Sorry, you go on.
Oh, they didn't. I know this, and it's been reported since too, that like they basically, the question for McDaniels is always, will you do what you did with Indianapolis again, kind of thing. And they kind of asked him like something along the lines of, would you, if Belichick retires next year, would you leave Green Bay to New England? And he kind of hesitated. And that's when they were kind of like, okay, well, we're out on that. Actually, do you guys know who the runner-up for, and this has been reported too, do you guys know who the runner-up was for the Matt LaFleur job, or for the Packers job after Matt LaFleur?
You're gonna say it, and it's gonna make sense, but
Wasn't
off the
it
top of my
the guy
head,
from
no.
the guy from the Lions, Colwell?
No, it was Todd Monken. He has been at the University of Georgia over the last few years with 45-year-old Stetson Bennett doing that, but he was the runner-up. So, you mentioned Brian Flores and Dan Campbell as far as taking the job over before. My first reaction to both of those guys not getting hired is thank God. I mean, I know the Lions are like the sexy pick this year, and I'll probably still pick them to win the North kind of by default. And that's mostly because I have no idea what Jordan Love is. But like, I don't know. I just think the meathead Dan Campbell thing eventually has an expiration date. I cannot picture Aaron Rodgers buying into Dan Campbell. I just don't think that would have gone well with what Green Bay wanted to do. Flores, maybe a little different. We'll see. He's the defensive coordinator this year in Minnesota. He did an okay job in Miami, but he was like back channeling, trying to get Deshaun Watson, like undermining the starting quarterback publicly, to which I don't really like that either. So I'd be curious how that would have gone. Monken hasn't gotten a head coaching job, but I think, the question you have is like, if they take a defensive coach or a culture coach, then yeah, that offensive coordinator job becomes very important. So now in Detroit, it's Ben Johnson. Is he in Green Bay? Is it Todd Monken? Do they say, hey, because I think they offered him the OC job in Green Bay, but he ended up going to Georgia and wanting to do things that way. Does Matt LaFleur get offered that offensive coordinator job? He probably doesn't take it because he's already got that job in Tennessee. Although he and Vrabel kind of butted heads a little bit while he was there. So maybe that doesn't work. I think that I kind of talked about the personality mesh and everything with Aaron Rodgers with some of those other guys, but I think that Matt LaFleur has certainly earned, they've won 60, 70% of the games that they've had, obviously some low moments in the postseason and everything like that, but that's kind of what happens when you win a bunch is there's going to be low moments and high moments in the playoffs. But I think that one of the things about Matt LaFleur is when he came in, he was given two objectives: revitalize the quarterback, kind of like Mike McCarthy did with Brett Favre at the end of his career, get the next guy ready, kind of like Mike McCarthy did with Aaron Rodgers when he got hired. And the other thing was to change the culture of a team that was mostly veteran. They had a big influx of talent, obviously, with the Smith brothers and Amos and Turner and that legendary free agent class coming in that year. But he had to change that culture. And this year, I've talked to a couple of guys that have been around teams like quarterback controversies and just kind of how that works out. And a couple of friends that I have they were around the Eagles when Nick Foles and Carson Wentz. Nick Foles wins the Super Bowl. Carson Wentz was probably the league MVP before he got injured that year. And maybe they would have won with him, who knows. But when that happened, and kind of famously now, is like Alshon Jeffrey was feeding lines to Josina Anderson about how he was, he wanted Foles, and he was getting busted on his burner Twitter account and saying he wanted Foles, and like just kind of how that split can take place. And it happened, oddly enough, again with the Eagles back in 2005, 2006, when they had Donovan McNabb and Terrell Owens butting heads with each other. Not a quarterback controversy, but two very large personalities in that locker room. And there were McNabb guys and there were Owens guys. Fast forward years later, there were Wentz guys and there were Foles guys. I promise you right now, and I know the quotes have been out there and everything like that, and that's good. You want to hear leaders of your team like Rashawn Gary and Jair Alexander and Aaron Jones talking about how we're behind this guy, we've got his back, blah, blah, all that stuff. There are guys in that locker room, and not just David Bakhtiari, that think they should have kept Rodgers.
For sure.
Maybe they're behind everything now, but one of LaFleur's challenges is to try and convince this team, number one, that we're still going to win, and we're going to win a lot this year. And two, kind of mitigate and migrate through that little wilderness of, there's 53 guys on this roster and 40 of them think that Love's our guy, but these 13 think we should have gone with Rodgers. How do you walk through that? Because again, I mentioned Bakhtiari. That's a prominent voice in that locker room. Preston Smith is a guy who I'm not suggesting anything I don't know, but he's a guy who makes sense to me that might think
that was my
Rodgers
first thought
is the
as well,
best
yeah.
one. But you got some of these veterans on the team that have been used to playing to go to the Super Bowl, and now like David Bakhtiari has used the word rebuild. Now it doesn't mean the same thing. Like he's kind of explained himself since then, but he did like that doesn't mean he thinks they're going to be bad. But I think he's kind of saying like the Packers at minimum are not on the short list of Super Bowl contenders anymore. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, even last year, it's like, well, they lost Devontae, but the Packers were still a trendy Super Bowl pick. It was, well, they're just going to have Rodgers kind of make things work, and the defense will be really good, and they have their run game and LaFleur and all that stuff, and we'll just kind of run from there. That didn't happen, obviously, but that's not like, I don't think you're going to find one respected national pundit that's not a complete homer. Like if James Jones, I mentioned earlier, picks them to win the Super Bowl, that's different. But like, I don't think you're going to find somebody say, nope, the Packers are going to the Super Bowl and they're going to win it. I don't think you'll get too many people like that. That is LaFleur's biggest challenge, maybe in his entire career, because those, like that locker room split with Wentz and Foles, that got Doug Peterson fired, Nick Foles got cut, and Carson Wentz got traded. Like they just wiped out all of that and were able, they kind of got, lucky's not the right word, but they're fortunate they drafted Jalen Hurts, and Howie Roseman to me is the best executive in the NFL right now. And they kind of had some forward thinking on that. But if Jalen Hurts doesn't pan out, Howie Roseman's looking for a job. That's a fine line you got to walk. And that split in that locker room can be valid, because I promise you what you can't have happen is, and this will happen, I promise you, Green Bay's in a game. It's competitive. Jordan Love makes that back-breaking young quarterback mistake. And you can't have these guys over here to the side whispering like, hey, man, Aaron would have won that game we would have won if Aaron was the quarterback, or something to that kind of effect. Can't have that. LaFleur has to be able to kind of eliminate that way of thinking from the entire locker room. And that's going to be tough because there are veterans, Jair Alexander, he's a young player in age, but not in NFL experience anymore. Rasul Douglas is a veteran, Preston Smith, Elton Jenkins, David Bakhtiari, John Runyon to some degree, Aaron Jones. Like there are dudes on this team that are veterans and used to competing for playing for a championship. And he has to get that buy-in on Jordan Love. And that's going to be difficult when there's going to be a game. Like there just is. He's a young quarterback. This isn't a slight to him. That's just, unless he's Patrick Mahomes, which asking him to do that, Mahomes won the league MVP in his first year as a starter and was on the doorstep of going to the Super Bowl. That's rare. Doesn't happen often. Unless he's that, Jordan Love's going to make a back-breaking mistake in a game that costs them the game. And maybe that'll happen multiple weeks in a row. The Packers, a losing streak is easier to navigate when you have a known commodity at quarterback. Because I can promise you, as the Packers, even last year when we were sitting here and going like, oh, they're 4 and whatever, is it time to go to Jordan Love? And all of them were like, no. Like, we're trying to make the playoffs. And if we have Aaron, we can make the playoffs and we can go on a run and win a championship. It's easier to do that when you have a known commodity. When you're 4-8 and the quarterback is unknown and you don't really know if you can make a run or anything like that, it's easier to start thinking about warm weather and golf courses. So watching LaFleur navigate that, I think he's the right man for that job just based on what we've seen. He's been able to navigate one of the most hostile situations in the last 10 years as far as the quarterback maybe wanting to be there, maybe not liking the general manager, just all the stuff that went in with the Rodgers stuff. Being able to navigate that, he's done well. But I will be curious how he does this year. This is his biggest challenge, and it's almost like starting completely over. Thankfully for him, he's got a bit of a track record to go with him now to where he can still tell his vets and stuff, hey, believe in me, believe in us. We've done this together before. But I'm curious to see how he handles that challenge. I think it's his biggest one.
Totally.
In my opinion, I don't really have opinion on the coaches because I have a hard time knowing who and what and whatever, because it seems sometimes that they pull coaches out of the weirdest spots, and I don't follow, all the coordinators on every team and who's ready to be the next next big head coach. Todd Monken would have been an interesting one. The only other time that I knew anything was McCarthy. When McCarthy was hired, it came down to McCarthy, Sean Payton, and Kirk Ferentz, and they preferred Kirk Ferentz, but Kirk Ferentz had just got a new raise at Iowa, so he went back to Iowa, and then it came down to McCarthy and Payton, and then they went with McCarthy, obviously. But other than that, I don't think the Packers are ever going to go with a defensive-minded coach again. I think they're going to stick mainly with the offensive coaches. Now, to say that, I could be completely wrong, but they've always had more of their successes coming from an offensive-minded coach than a defensive-minded coach. So, who knows what's going to happen in the future, but I think they would have, if it wasn't LaFleur, it was going to be another offensive-minded coach. And just off the top of my head, I can't think of who was in that coaching carousel that year that was all offensive-minded. Had it been Josh McDaniels, I wouldn't have been happy. I do not like him. And I don't think the Packers would have succeeded with him. Do you know who else was in that carousel that was offensive-minded?
Yes. So well, Dan Campbell theoretically, but not really. He's not really a play caller kind of guy. The other big one who was, I think, probably the most terrifying option was Adam Gase, and that would have been absolute hell. But yeah, I mean, kind of like Jacob mentioned, it was like Todd Monken, Matt LaFleur, Adam Gase, and like Jim Caldwell, who's not really a super like offensive minded guy anyway. But those
Gase would have been interesting in a way because he had ability, but he was always going to these teams that had no.
No.
I mean, look at where he went. He went to the Bears and he went to the Jets, and there was nothing.
No, Gase is. No, I had nothing good to say about Gase.
But it's just
He wasn't even bad enough to help the Dolphins tank.
Well, I just say that would have been an interesting one just because of everything. I don't know.
No, totally.
Again, I don't follow all the coaches everywhere.
Sure.
Hell, I didn't even know who LaFleur was until his name popped up as a candidate for the Packers head coach. Well, I didn't know who Mike McCarthy was.
Yeah, right. No, it's funny because, I put some of these guys on the list here, but the Packers haven't hired a defensive-minded coach for 40 years. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Wasn't Ray Rhodes?
Well, what year was that?
99.
Oh, okay.
I could be wrong, but I think Ray Rhodes is a defensive coach.
But I guess historically they've liked to, as you said, they liked the offensive guys, and yeah, you really are playing with fire when you have a defensive-minded coach at leading the ship, right? You really depending on your offensive coach to have a good reason to stick around. I mean, I'm one of the people who I like what the Lions are doing, but I think so much of their success is predicated on the excellence of Ben Johnson, and the only reason why I really thought that they could threaten the NFC this year is because he's stuck around. If he left in this coaching cycle, it would be a totally different story. I think he's more of the driver behind that success than really anything else on that team.
And I just looked it up. Yeah, Ray Rhodes is a defensive coach. He was a defensive coordinator and all that. So that was 99. But that was still, almost 25 years?
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
and that's one in between multiple others.
Well, the only reason I know that one for sure is because I went up to my very first game at Lambeau that year. So my first game at Lambeau was under Ray Rhodes. So
yeah.
But yeah, I just think that no matter what, even with them having Aaron Rodgers, they would have never went to a defensive-minded coach. Now, had they went in and Rodgers was still a rookie, blah, 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 I think there would have been a chance. but Rodgers established they were going to go for an offensive-minded coach. So, yeah, LaFleur made a lot of sense once I found out who he was. And like I said, Monken would have been interesting. And once Jacob mentioned it, I do remember them offering Todd Monken the offensive coordinator position. I think that was the year Joe Philbin left to go to Miami.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, cool. Well, is there anything else that you want to talk about before we wrap up here?
No. For those that are kind of wondering, Jacob had to drop off because he was getting beat and his son was starting to wake up. So we're just finishing out while he's tending to other things. So no, we didn't mute him. No, he's not being quiet.
He's been kicked off. Well, guys, for now, we're still on Twitter. Who knows what's going to happen with Threads or Blue Sky or any of that. But as always, you can find us at Twitter. Find Jacob at Jacob Westendorf, myself at Nicholas GRGR, Joe at Iowa_Joe86, and the podcast at Outback_Packers. Feel free to give the pod a rating on Apple, on Spotify, on Stitcher, and on Twitter while it's still around. We'd love to see some retweets, some quote tweets, some likes, shares, all that good stuff. We'd love interacting with you guys and hearing what you have to say. Until next time, we'll see you later.